Sarah Walker was just like any other ambitious young woman. After graduating from high school with honors, she set her sights on Crestwood College, one of the most prestigious institutions in the state. Known for its rigorous academic programs, Crestwood was where dreams were either made or broken. Sarah's dream was to become an engineer, a career she hadn't initially considered but was encouraged to pursue by her family. She had always been an overachiever, but beneath her confident exterior was the same uncertainty that plagued many of her peers. Choosing a college major was daunting, and she often wondered if engineering was truly the right path for her. Despite her doubts, Sarah pushed forward, determined to make something of herself. Crestwood College was located in a quiet, picturesque town, surrounded by rolling hills and dense forests. The campus itself was a mix of modern buildings and older, more traditional structures, with the dormitories located on the edge of the grounds. Crestwood Dormitory, where Sarah was assigned to live, was one of the older buildings, a tall, Gothic-style structure, with ivy climbing up its stone walls and narrow, creaking hallways. It had once been a grand mansion, donated to the college by a wealthy alumnus decades earlier. Now, it housed nearly 50 students. The first few weeks at Crestwood passed uneventfully. Sarah quickly settled into a routine. Classes in the morning, study sessions in the library, and late-night conversations with her two roommates, Emma and Rachel. The three of them shared a small room on the fourth floor of the dormitory, and while it was cramped, they had become fast friends. Sarah was closest to Emma, a fellow engineering student with a bright, bubbly personality that contrasted Sarah's more serious demeanor. Rachel, on the other hand, was quieter, often keeping to herself. She was a philosophy major, and while she was friendly enough, there was always something slightly off about her, something Sarah couldn't quite put her finger on. As the semester progressed, life at Crestwood seemed to settle into a comfortable rhythm. Sarah excelled in her classes, spent hours in the library, and began to feel like she was truly on the right path. But then, everything changed. It was early November, and most of the students had left campus for fall break. While many of Sarah's friends had gone home to spend time with their families, she had chosen to stay behind to catch up on some coursework. Emma had left a few days earlier, but Rachel, like Sarah, had stayed at the dormitory, claiming she had too much work to do to bother going home. With most of the other students gone, Crestwood Dormitory was eerily quiet. The usual sounds of laughter and conversation had been replaced by an unsettling silence that seemed to creep through the hallways like a cold draft. Sarah didn't mind the quiet, though. It gave her a chance to focus. She spent her days in the library and her nights in the dorm, catching up on assignments and preparing for exams. One evening, after a long day of studying, Sarah returned to her dorm room to find Rachel sitting on her bed, staring blankly at the wall. It wasn't unusual for Rachel to be lost in thought. She was, after all, a philosophy major. But there was something different about her this time. Her normally calm expression was replaced by a distant, almost vacant look, and her hands were busy tying a black string around her wrist. "Hey, Rachel," Sarah said as she set her bag down by her bed. "You okay?" Rachel didn't respond at first. She continued to tie the string, looping it around her wrist several times before pulling it tight. Then, slowly, she turned to face Sarah, her eyes wide and unfocused. "You know," Rachel said in a low voice, "with this string, I can control anyone." Sarah frowned, unsure of what to say. "What do you mean?" Rachel smiled, a strange, twisted smile that sent a chill down Sarah's spine. "I can make my parents do whatever I want. I can control them. I can control anyone." Sarah laughed nervously, trying to shake off the unease she felt. "Okay, Rachel, whatever you say." But Rachel wasn't laughing. Her expression remained cold, distant, and unsettling. For the first time, Sarah felt truly uncomfortable around her roommate. There was something wrong, something she couldn't explain, but she could feel it in the air. That night, Sarah had trouble sleeping. The room felt different, heavier somehow, as if the very air had grown thicker. She tossed and turned, unable to shake the strange feeling that something was watching her. At around 2 a.m., she finally gave up and sat up in bed, glancing over at Rachel's side of the room. Rachel was lying in bed, her back to Sarah, but even in the darkness, Sarah could sense that something was off. The way Rachel's body was positioned, rigid, unmoving, it didn't look natural. Sarah's heart began to race, but she tried to calm herself down. Maybe Rachel was just a heavy sleeper. Then she heard it. A faint knocking sound, like someone tapping on the window next to her bed. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She turned toward the window, but there was nothing there, just the faint outline of the trees outside, swaying gently in the night breeze. She shook her head, telling herself it was just her imagination, and lay back down. But then it happened again, another knock, this time louder. Sarah sat up, her heart pounding in her chest. She stared at the window, her pulse quickening as the knocking grew louder and more persistent. She was about to get up to investigate when she heard something else, something far more terrifying. A voice. It was faint, almost a whisper, but it was unmistakable. Someone or something was speaking, just outside her window. Sarah froze, her mind racing. There was no way anyone could be out there. Her room was on the 4th floor, and there was no balcony or fire escape. But the voice continued, soft and insistent, growing louder with each passing second. She didn't dare move. She didn't even want to breathe. And then suddenly, the voice stopped. The knocking stopped. The room fell silent once more. Sarah let out a shaky breath, her body trembling with fear. She reached for her phone on the nightstand, ready to call someone, anyone, when she heard a rustling sound coming from Rachel's bed. Slowly, Sarah turned to look at her roommate. What she saw made her blood run cold. Rachel was no longer lying in bed. She was floating, her body suspended several feet above the mattress, her long, dark hair hanging down like a curtain. Her eyes were wide open, staring blankly at the ceiling, and her limbs were stiff, as if she were a puppet being held up by invisible strings. Sarah couldn't move. She couldn't speak. All she could do was watch in horror as Rachel's body hovered in the air, completely motionless. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. Rachel's body fell back onto the bed with a soft thud, her eyes closing as if nothing had happened. For a moment, Sarah thought she might be dreaming. But the terror she felt was too real, too intense to be a dream. She had just witnessed something impossible, something that defied explanation. She needed to get out of there. Sarah leaped out of bed and ran for the door, her hands shaking as she fumbled with the lock. She didn't look back. She didn't want to. She just needed to get away from whatever was happening in that room. She sprinted down the hallway, her footsteps echoing off the walls as she made her way to Lily's room. Lily was one of the few students who had also stayed behind during fall break, and Sarah knew she would be there. She banged on the door, her heart pounding in her chest. "Lily, open the door!" Sarah shouted, her voice trembling. The door opened a moment later, and Lily appeared, looking groggy and confused. "Sarah? What's going on?" "It's Rachel," Sarah gasped, struggling to catch her breath. She's floating." Lily frowned, clearly not understanding. "What are you talking about?" "I'm serious, Lily. You have to come see." Reluctantly, Lily followed Sarah back down the hall to their room. When they arrived, everything seemed normal. Rachel was lying in bed, her eyes closed, breathing softly as if she were asleep. Lily shot Sarah a skeptical look. "Are you sure you weren't just dreaming?" Sarah shook her head, her pulse still racing. "I wasn't dreaming, Lily, I swear." But before Lily could respond, Rachel's eyes suddenly snapped open. She sat up in bed, her head turning slowly to face them. A wide, malevolent smile spread across her face, a smile that sent chills down Sarah's spine. Without warning, Rachel began to laugh. It wasn't a normal laugh, though. It was a deep, guttural sound, as if two people were laughing at once. One voice high and feminine, the other low and masculine. Rachel stood up, her movements jerky and unnatural, and started toward them. Sarah grabbed Lily's arm and pulled her out of the room, slamming the door behind them. "We need to get help," Sarah whispered, her voice shaking. They ran down the hallway, pounding on the doors of the few students who were still in the dorm. One by one, the other girls emerged from their rooms, confused and scared, as Sarah and Lily explained what had happened. By now, panic was spreading through the hallways of Crestwood Dormitory. The small group of remaining students clustered together, their faces pale with fear as they listened to Sarah and Lily recount the bizarre events. Though none of them had seen what Sarah had witnessed firsthand, there was an air of tension so thick it felt like a living presence in the room. The dormitory had always been a place of quiet study and refuge. but tonight it felt foreign, as if the walls themselves were hiding secrets. The creaking floorboards beneath their feet, the dim, flickering lights in the hallway, all of it contributed to an overwhelming sense of dread. Even those who hadn't directly seen the strange happenings could feel something was wrong. As Sarah finished telling them about Rachel's unsettling behavior, the door to their room slowly creaked open, revealing Rachel standing there. Her face was twisted into a grin, her eyes wide, as if something inside her was watching from behind her pupils. The way she moved, jerky and unnatural, sent shivers down everyone's spines. "What's going on, guys?" Rachel asked, her voice sounding too calm, too normal for what Sarah had just described. The way she spoke was disconnected from her facial expression, which still held that unnerving, twisted grin. "Stay away from us," one of the girls shouted, backing up. Rachel tilted her head, a lock of her dark hair falling over her face. "Why are you all acting so weird?" It was then that Sarah noticed something truly disturbing. Rachel was no longer wearing the black string she had tied around her wrist earlier that evening. In its place was an angry, red welt, almost like a burn, circling her wrist as if something had been digging into her skin. Sarah's voice cracked. "Rachel, please, just stay back." Rachel's grin faltered, replaced by confusion. "What are you talking about? What's wrong with me?" No one answered. The room fell silent as they all stared at her, their minds racing. Whatever had been happening to Rachel, it wasn't her fault, but that didn't make her any less terrifying. Every instinct in Sarah screamed that something dark was manipulating her roommate, something far beyond their understanding. The tension was finally broken when Lily, who had been silent until now, spoke up. "Rachel, you need to lie down. You're not well." Rachel's eyes narrowed. "Not well? I feel fine." Lily stepped forward, trying to stay calm. "Please, just lie down, okay? We'll call someone to help." Rachel hesitated, but something in Lily's calm tone seemed to reach her. She glanced at Sarah and then back to Lily, her grin slowly fading. "Okay," she whispered, her voice suddenly weak as if she were exhausted. The girls watched, holding their breath as Rachel turned and shuffled back into the room. Sarah quickly followed, determined to make sure her roommate stayed put. When Rachel crawled back into bed and pulled the covers up to her chin, she looked so small and fragile. It was hard to believe that just moments earlier, something monstrous had seemed to take hold of her. The group gathered in the hallway outside the room, their voices hushed. They didn't know what to do next. They could call campus security, but what would they say? How could they explain what had happened without sounding insane? "We can't just leave her in there," Sarah whispered. Lily nodded, biting her lip. "But if we stay, we might not be safe." One of the girls, Megan, pulled out her phone. "I'm calling the campus counselor. We can't handle this on our own." As Megan dialed, the others stood in tense silence, their ears straining for any sound from the room. For a long while, there was nothing. The quiet was suffocating, pressing in on them as they waited. But then, just as they began to relax, a loud thud echoed from within the room. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She rushed to the door and pushed it open, her pulse racing. Rachel was no longer in her bed. The covers were thrown aside, the window wide open, cold air rushing in. Sarah rushed to the window, leaning out into the night, her breath catching in her throat. Down below, she could just make out a figure, Rachel, walking barefoot across the courtyard, her movements slow and mechanical, like a puppet being pulled along by invisible strings. The way her body swayed and jerked as she walked was wrong, deeply unsettling. "Oh my God," Lily whispered from behind her. "What's she doing?" "I don't know," Sarah replied, her voice trembling. "But we need to follow her." Without hesitation, Sarah grabbed her coat and hurried out of the room, the others trailing behind her. They raced down the stairs and out into the chilly night air, their breath forming clouds in the cool autumn breeze. Rachel was already halfway across the courtyard, her figure barely visible in the shadows cast by the streetlights. Sarah and the others followed, keeping their distance, unsure of what Rachel might do next. As they trailed her, the campus seemed eerily empty. The usually vibrant, lively grounds felt abandoned, and the only sounds were the soft rustling of leaves and the distant hum of the wind. There was no one else around, no students, no staff. It was as if the entire world had fallen silent. leaving only them and Rachel in the strange, surreal stillness. Rachel led them across campus, past the library and the dining hall, toward a wooded area on the outskirts of the grounds. The further they went, the darker it became, the trees looming overhead like twisted sentinels, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. "Where is she going?" Megan asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," Sarah replied, her stomach knotting with dread. "But we need to be careful." They reached the edge of the woods, and Rachel disappeared into the shadows, her figure swallowed by the dense foliage. Sarah hesitated for a moment, unsure whether to follow. But before she could decide, Lily grabbed her arm. "We can't go in there," Lily said, her voice shaking. "It's too dangerous." But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they had to go after her, that if they didn't, something terrible would happen. "I'm going," Sarah said firmly. "You guys can stay here if you want, but I can't just leave her." Before anyone could argue, Sarah stepped into the trees, the branches closing in around her as she followed Rachel's trail. The woods were dark and foreboding, the moonlight barely filtering through the thick canopy above. Sarah's footsteps were soft on the damp ground, and the only sound was the occasional rustle of leaves as she pushed forward. Up ahead, she could just make out Rachel's figure, moving deeper into the woods. Sarah quickened her pace, determined to catch up, but as she got closer, she noticed something strange. Rachel wasn't alone. Standing beside her, barely visible in the shadows, was a tall figure. It was difficult to make out any details, but the figure was unnaturally tall and thin, its limbs long and spindly like the branches of the trees. Sarah's heart raced as she watched, her mind struggling to comprehend what she was seeing. The figure seemed to be speaking to Rachel, though Sarah couldn't hear the words. Rachel stood motionless, her head tilted back as if in a trance, her arms hanging limply at her sides. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She knew she had to do something, but her body was frozen with fear. The figure leaned down, its face inches from Rachel's, and for a moment, Sarah thought it might consume her. But then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. Rachel collapsed to the ground, her body limp and lifeless. "Rachel!" Sarah shouted, rushing forward. She reached her roommate and knelt beside her, her hands shaking as she checked for a pulse. To her immense relief, Rachel was still breathing, though her pulse was faint. Behind her, the others arrived, their faces pale with fear. Lily knelt beside Sarah, her eyes wide as she took in the sight of Rachel lying unconscious on the forest floor. "What happened?" Lily asked, her voice trembling. Sarah shook her head, her heart pounding. I don't know." They stayed like that for a few moments, unsure of what to do next, when suddenly Rachel's eyes snapped open. She gasped, sitting up abruptly, her face pale and her eyes wild. "Sarah," Rachel whispered, her voice weak, "it's still here." "What?" Sarah asked, her blood running cold. "What's still here?" Rachel's eyes darted around as if searching for something. The thing in the woods. It's still here. It won't leave me alone." The others exchanged worried glances, unsure of what to believe. But Sarah could see the fear in Rachel's eyes. The same fear she had felt earlier that night. "We need to get out of here," Sarah said, helping Rachel to her feet. Together they made their way back to the dormitory, their footsteps quick and hurried as they left the dark woods behind. But even as they returned to the safety of the campus, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them, lurking just out of sight. The rest of the night passed in a blur. The campus counselor arrived, followed by campus security, but no one could explain what had happened. Rachel was taken to the infirmary, where she was treated for shock, and the others were left to wonder if they had just imagined the whole thing. In the days that followed, the story of what had happened in the dormitory spread like wildfire. Students whispered about Rachel's strange behavior, about the figure in the woods, and about the black string she had worn around her wrist. Some said it was a curse, others claimed it was the result of black magic. But Sarah knew the truth. Whatever had happened to Rachel, it wasn't over. Months passed, and Crestwood College returned to normal. The incident was chalked up to stress, exhaustion, and hysteria, and most of the students moved on, eager to forget the strange events of that night. But Sarah couldn't forget. She often thought about that night in the woods, about the figure she had seen and the terror in Rachel's eyes. and every now and then, when she was alone in her room, she would hear it. A faint knock at the window, followed by a whisper, soft and insistent. It was still here, and it wasn't going away.